Hi, welcome to my little talk about Magento 2 linking JavaScript components. Anton is supposed to be sitting here later on as well, and he told me one thing about my presentation, but I'm getting to that in a few points. How many of you are familiar anyway with the term of linking JavaScript components in the first place? A few hands. So I'm going to focus on something actually that has nothing to do with this slide, because but I just want to show you that I created a slide with JavaScript and a little bit of Markdown, and actually I created the second slide as well, just to show you that JavaScript is becoming more and more part of our daily life. And before I actually dive into the topic that we're going to deal with, JavaScript components, first a couple of heads up on who I am. My name is Jisse Reitsma from the Netherlands. I own a little company called Yireo, and what I do is I give trainings, I organize a couple of events. I'll get back to that later on as well. And I develop code. Because of the trainings and because of the events, I was also announced a master. Sometimes I'm referred to as Knockout Jisse, and I don't have a clue on why that actually is. So if somebody refers to me in that way, talk to that person. And I simply love Magento 2, so hence we come up with a presentation on JavaScript components. I'm diving into JavaScript components using a couple of slide examples. The slide examples are going to focus on RequireJS and Knockout.js. So a few hands popped up when I asked, like, are you familiar with JavaScript component linking? Who of you is familiar with RequireJS and Knockout.js? So that's about half of the room, which is okay. Because I'm going to rely on that technology actually to explain what this JavaScript component linking actually is. It's referring to a specific syntax within a JavaScript component that Magento 2 has invented to a couple of components together using a property called imports, or a property called exports, or a property called links, which is basically importing and exporting at the same time. And I'm going through a couple of code samples to actually show you what is being done with this whole linking part. But more specifically, I'm going to give a personal opinion on this. And then slowly we're leading up to the point where actually Anton, just before this talk started, asked me a specific question on my personal opinion. Because this might be one of the stranger talks of this Meet Magento Poland. Normally you get a technical talk when somebody is going to advise you to do things in a certain way. I'm going to explain you how not to do it. So that's like the opposite of learning something, it's actually unlearning maybe something. I'm getting to that. First of all, I created a small module which is on GitHub. So all of the code samples are there just to have a peek at. And in this code sample, I simply created a small module. It's not complex, it's composed of a couple of files. The first two files simply registering the component or the module in the first place. I'm using a little bit of XML layout to initialize the block classes that I'm going to work with. Or actually, I don't have my own block class. I'm simply reusing a generic block class because I don't deal with functionality. I only want to focus on the JavaScript part. So actually, the PHTML templates are only there to initialize a JavaScript component. And then the actual JavaScript component, there's two of them. That's what you see at the bottom, component 1 and component 2. And guess what? We're going to link them together and see what happens. So within the XML layout, I simply start with the definition that I want to add something to a container called content, and what I'm going to add. It's a generic component block with simply template. So I'm not introducing my own block class, I'm just reusing the generic one. I'm giving it a name and I'm giving it a template. So there we are with a PHTML template. And I'm going to do the same thing twice because I have two components, two different PHTML templates. So theoretically, the two components that we're going to talk about are not within the same module, but they're actually spread across different modules. For instance, what I could do is maybe reuse a component already initialized by the Magento core and reuse it in my own module. But this is just a sample. I'm just reusing my own components, setting them up in a really clean way with small, simple code. Now, this is actually the part where we're slowly going to dive into the JavaScript area. I'm first starting with the second component. And in the second component, there's going to be some PHTML. And the PHTML is printing out the div with a data bind. Scope is component 2. And here I'm going to assume that you already know a little bit about RequireJS and Knockout in the first place. But the way that a JavaScript component is actually hooked into the HTML document is using a data bind like this with a missing link. Because as soon as I have the data binding up and running, I also need this more or less script, JavaScript-like tag. It's not JavaScript because it's not type is text/JavaScript or application. It's not JavaScript. It's this other JSON format being interpreted by the Magento core, and specifically the DOM ID example component 2 is something I'm going to link to an actual JavaScript component, and the JavaScript component is named component 2. So this is just to get the basics going, and I'm going to do the same thing more or less for component 1. And the only difference now with component 1 is that within the div of the first component, component 1, I'm simply going to add a data bind with a text message. And the text message is now waiting, so it's a dummy placeholder. And I'm going to replace this little span text with something else on the fly using JavaScript. So in the end, that JavaScript piece could be coming from the server, it could be printing the current customer name. I'm simply focusing on the JavaScript area. There's going to be a component 1 and a component 2. And first of all, I'm going to get things working so that component 1 is replacing this little text, the message, from waiting into something else. And how to do that? Well, then I have to dive actually into the JavaScript part itself. I'm making it easier for myself by creating a RequireJS alias. So now I can refer to component 1 and component 2 as a shortcut to the actual path. But then the actual path begins really simple. It's a component file, not doing much. How many of you are familiar with this kind of syntax? So slowly we're losing like hands. No worries, because this is really like diving into the JavaScript area and JavaScript components. A lot of times you use them instead of actually writing them yourself. But if you write them yourself, the usual thing that you do is you start with a define statement that's RequireJS, and then the define statement is calling upon a couple of dependencies, in this case only one, that's called UiComponent. And then an instance of UiComponent is inserted into this variable called component. And what I'm doing here is simply extending upon this parent component and doing stuff. Or actually, I'm not doing anything yet. And that's the main point of this component 2, because I first want to get component 1 up and running. And component 1 is very, very simple. It's simply adding a message property to the internal data array of this component. And because of this, actually the text waiting that was first in my PHTML is already changing into hello world. So just to make sure, we have a message property right here. And if I scroll back all the way to here, I can see actually a message property also in the HTML DOM. And now it was waiting, but as soon as we actually load this JavaScript component, it's printing out hello world. And I'm printing out hello world because this is still not dealing with JavaScript component linking, my title of my presentation. It's simply the basics of how JavaScript component from JavaScript itself is able to modify the DOM with the result something like this. So it's printing hello world. I think I'm like halfway in my talk already, because now I need to add component linking to this thing. But before we get there, first a little bit of the architecture involved. We have the XML layout, the PHTML creating the placeholders, then this XMagento init structure is used to actually initialize all of the JavaScript components. Component 1 is now delivering output, so that's like the proof of concept, and component 2 is not doing anything yet. So let's make sure that component 2 is now doing something. By introducing, exporting and importing, linking component 1 to component 2. And so far component 1 was simply outputting a message. And now, guess what? I want to output the message actually in component 1, but by adding the value to component 2. And how to do that? Well, here we are. It's not really complex. The only thing that I added now is basically add to my second component an export statement with a specific property linking. First of all, in the defaults array, I have a message property hello from component 2. And then actually in the defaults array as well, I have an exports array with message, meaning my message. So that's the value hello from component 2. And then a second thing called component 1 column message. And this is actually where the magic starts. Component 1 is actually referring to more or less the view model name component 1 that I worked with before. Component 1 also has a message property. That message property might have been hello world because that's the proof of concept that we just saw. But now actually this export is overriding it, and suddenly the message of component 1 is hello from component 2. Proof of concept, it works. I think I'm already like 3/4 at my presentation because the only thing I needed to explain was have an exports array. But we also have imports. So what I can do is just change my components a little bit and remove the stuff from the component 2. So the component 2 only has a message property. And now I go to component 1 and I'm importing the stuff that came from component 2 within my component 1. The syntax is more or less the same, but the message is now differently imported from component 1. I'm able to import a property from component 2. So under the hood, a lot of things are happening, and I'm not really diving into those details because most of the time you don't need to know about it. But if you dive into the logic of component, UI component is extending from, but I might be telling this wrong, UI component is extending from UI element, and I think UI element is shipping with all of this automatic linking. Is that correct, Anton? So if you dive into the code, you might understand a little bit more like how this is working. And what I didn't really explain from the code sample is actually that the importing and exporting has a couple of benefits. So first of all, what you see is what you get. So following my sample slides, what you can do is just reuse a property from one place to another. Import a property from one component to the other component. But underneath, actually also that component that you import, or the component property that you import, or the component property that you export, becomes observable as well. So as soon as I actually modify message on my component 1 side, it might be linked to the message property of component 2 as well. So meaning that actually you have these two different components, and by linking the property, actually vice versa, any change is replicated to the other side as well, which is kind of cool. But before I explain kind of and why I still have my personal opinion on this to go, let's make this little sample a little bit more complex by introducing the concept of a provider, because this is actually what you bump into most of the time with Magento 2 JavaScript logic. And it starts with a little property that I mentioned before on my slide as well. Component 1 has its own name component wrapped up in its own properties, but there's another property called a provider, and now provider is actually linking back to this other component too. But this is only a string, it's just a simple property with a string value. But what I'm able to do is actually use this value as an internal property, this.provider. So by using this term provider, I'm able to say, well, this one component has a provider, not multiple providers, but a single provider, and that's the other component, in this case component 2. And because it's an internal property, I'm able to do something really weird. which is yet another extension upon this same concept, namely template literals. And how many of you are familiar with template literals? And the number of hands keep going down. So after a point, I hope actually Bartek is not putting his hand up anymore. So what is template literal? It's this weird thingy that you see here. The dollar is actually referring to a variable just like in PHP. But now actually it's based on JavaScript, modern JavaScript, ES6, ECMAScript 6. And $.provider is being translated on the fly into this provider, this dot provider. However, it's wrapped around parentheses again with another dollar, meaning that as soon as we've located $.provider, which has, slide back, the value component2, then I'm calling upon component2 again with a $sign, so I'm referring not to a string called component2, but I'm referring to the actual other JavaScript component called component2, and then I'm linking it to column message. So what you see here is nothing more than a dynamic way that from the really easy example I gave earlier. But this is just to make sure that we can make it a little bit more configurable by not modifying the JavaScript right here, but actually outputting different properties within the PHTML template, and now we can configure this maybe using XML layout. So the whole thing becomes easily configurable at the cost of a lot of hands going down because nobody has heard of template literals yet. Well, now you do. But one of the questions you could ask yourself is, well, this is complicating this whole thing. Is it the wise choice to actually introduce template literals only because of this feature? Which brings me slowly to my personal opinion. What are we doing? So what we've gone through is a really basic example of linking one component with another component. And the first thing is, it's all based on RequireJS. So RequireJS is one of the fundamental tools here, which is kind of cool because it allows you to import functionality from another class, another library. So that's basically dependency injection on the JavaScript level. And if you like PHP dependency injection, you most likely also like RequireJS. Now Knockout.js is making this much more complex because actually a component, what I mentioned before, is not just a JavaScript library, it's actually a JavaScript library that is hooked into the DOM, which allowed me to print out the message on one end in the PHTML template, or actually in the browser, while the property of that message is actually coming from the component one on the JavaScript level. And Knockout is allowing me to do so by turning actually a JavaScript component into a so-called view model. Now, view models might be all over the place, so we have this other thing called the uiRegistry to keep track of which view model is bound to which kind of which part of the DOM. And then importing and exporting allows you to make cross-references from all of those view models and all of those components from one way to the other. But even worse, because my code sample actually showed that without component 2 knowing about it, I was able to import properties into component 1. Or vice versa, without component 1 knowing about it, component 2 is able to export properties to component 1. So one component is able to modify the other component without that component knowing about it, which is awesome and complex. So I came up with the idea like how to visualize all of these view models interconnected using imports and exports. And I started really to draw a graph based on the actual Magento 2 code. I gave up after half an hour and I said like, well, this doesn't make sense. So this is like a Google image, but you get the point basically. It's complex and it's interconnecting everything. Which makes you wonder like, okay, but is this still clean code? Is this like the thing that we're supposed to use? Because if we're talking about clean code, we might also think about design patterns. And what I mentioned about RequireJS is actually RequireJS is all about dependency injection. Dependency injection is a design pattern. Hooray, we're doing something in a standard way. Another thing is RequireJS is introducing composition over inheritance because we're allowed to inject new components into other components without actually using inheritance from one parent to a child. But to my opinion, actually inheritance in this case is not only dealing with from one parent to a child, but actually from one component to another component. So what you're doing with component linking, as I mentioned in my talk, is actually you're doing it in the inheritance way. But normally a parent and a child, the parent knows whose child it has, or what kind of children it has, and the child knows what kind of parent it has. But with component linking, it's like an adoption process gone berserk. It's nobody knows like whose children are belonging to which parents. So my main concept is that my personal opinion is that the components shouldn't be linked, or the components properties shouldn't be linked, because that's actually messing up any design pattern that you might have. But the component themselves might be linked to another component. So linking components is allowing us to work with how do you say that, self-contained units, and then all of those self-contained units might be talking to other units, but don't mess around with whatever is within that unit, even though it's kind of cool, but it's simply complicating things too much. So it made me think like, what am I doing here standing in front of you and telling you about the JavaScript component? Well, I actually disagree with it. So I came up with a couple of code constructs that work around this, without actually using JavaScript component linking in the first place. And the best example I came up with is this. It allows you to import UiComponent, that's what we did before, and I'll also import uiRegistry. But within the uiRegistry, I know that actually another component, another view model of that component is actually registered in that uiRegistry. So if I need something from this other component, instead of actually doing that automatically on the fly with a lot of magic, which might be really easy, but it's actually confusing, I might also do it manually, which looks far more elaborate, but at least you have full control over what is linked where. So that's kind of the cool thing. What I also tried to do was solve it with DI. And that's actually bumping into a small, really weird issue as well. What you can see here on line 4 is actually showing the issue. If I'm importing another component, that component is not the same thing as the view model on the knockout level. Meaning that what I'm talking about in my title is actually wrong. I'm not linking JavaScript components, I'm linking JavaScript view models. And every component is able to generate a JavaScript view model, a knockout view model, by returning the right value, and the return value might be an object literal, but it might also be then a full-blown component as we talk about, and that's actually a function. So then actually I'm instantiating component 2 and component 2 with parentheses, and then I'm treating an object like it's a function, and then all of the weirdness of JavaScript is in place. So I'm actually not really in favor of this one as well. But at least it's a workaround. But it comes a little bit to my personal opinion. It's complex. It has some features which are interesting, but how to move forward from here. I would say that dependency injection using RequireJS is much better than linking those properties together, because it's getting messy if you don't know what kind of properties are linked to what kind of other components. It requires you to do a lot of self-study on JavaScript, because like almost all of the hands went down with template literals, while template literals is actually supposed to be one of the features of ECMAScript 6 that you should know about. And well, what I mentioned here as well is a focus on JavaScript testing, because all of those features, they become something, they come to life. But it's not necessarily something that you want to reuse. So it's actually adding ease of configuration. It was really easy to actually add importing and exporting to our component, but actually the complexity rises really quickly, and the only way to guarantee that the complexity is still under control is testing. tomorrow, Anton is going to discuss, is it really like a discussion that you're going to lead? Things like this, so it's more like the best practices. And I would say personally that one of the best practices would be to stay away from JavaScript component linking. So that's actually my final touch. It's my personal opinion, which is kind of weird. But does Anton agree? Of course. So be aware that this feature, this functionality is kind of cool and it does a lot of things on the fly automatically. And that's the current state of Magento 2 in the front end. But it might not be one of the best IDs. So be aware that this is more or less like an advanced feature that might be changed in the near future with upcoming releases. Now, before I stop talking, because I think my time is almost up, and 2 minutes, right in time. I just also wanted to introduce a little event that was on the slide of Max just minutes ago or half an hour ago as well, MAGE Testfest. A little bit of self-promotion. It's a conference in the Netherlands taking place in 2 months' time between 15th and 18th of November. And the unique thing about this conference is it's not like a conference with a lot of mixed topics. It's not mixed with a lot of different speakers. It's actually focused on a small subset of speakers that are awesome. Sebastian Bergman is there, Matthias Verhaas, Vinay Kopp, James Cowie. They're all going to talk about testing specifically. So it doesn't have to do anything with my talk, but I just wanted to get it out there. That being said, are there any questions on my topic of JavaScript component linking?
One time question, I have some kind of advice that using the different methods in Magento 2 is kind of risky because the JavaScript minifier written in PHP don't handle ES6 well. There is an open issue and we have to wait. Of course, if we use it as users use it, so in one line it's perfectly fine, but when you split it to a few lines and add some other stuff right there will be an issue.
Yeah. So maybe in short, there's some pending bugs, or there's maybe one pending bug that is stopping you to do static content deployment properly because of ES6 support?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a bug in the library that was used until 2.1.3, I think.
Okay.
It was upgraded in later versions. But tomorrow we'll discuss a different way how to actually do proper bundling without using built-in bundler, PHP bundler, which is very nice.
So in short, tomorrow the talk of Anton is going to be awesome. Well, if there's no other question, thank you and see you later.